Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Khosh Amadid. My name is Lise Doucette from the BBC, and like all of you here today, I think I can say, I have been thinking about, worrying about, caring about, visiting, living in Afghanistan for a very long time. As we all say, nobody goes to Afghanistan once. And what brings us here today? Afghanistan 2020. Not a World Cup, not a trade fair, but Afghanistan 2020, the future of a country which nearly 16 years after massive international engagement and a new coming together of Afghans still has not achieved the political stability, the prosperity that all Afghans had hoped for. You'll remember at that time in 2001, it was regarded as the best chance in a generation. We come here together to discuss a new report by the United States Institute of Peace, Political Stability in Afghanistan, a 2020 vision and roadmap. And it's a very, very good report. To discuss all of this, we have the report, we have a fantastic panel, we have all of you, and we have those who are joining us online. And thank you to those of you joining us online. We have a hashtag, if you are of the tweeting variety, hashtag Afghanistan 2020. And if we are lucky, someone who's known to take to Twitter may get on to the tweets, and the Commander-in-Chief will tell us how many troops he plans to send to Afghanistan. But he may be busy today, but that's okay. To our panel, I'm the person who came the farthest today to join us, Fawzia Kofi, on the line, look, with her elegant Afghan scarf, joining us. Fawzia Kofi, Khosh Amadid, thank you very much for making time for us. You've got the map of Afghanistan above your head. All of you may know or have met Fawzia Kofi, a member of Parliament. She's also the head of the Women's Affairs, Human Rights and Civil Society Commission of Afghanistan. We're also very privileged to have and welcome to London Ambassador Saeed Jawad, who was the ambassador to the United States for Afghanistan. He also served as the Chief of Staff for President Hamid Karzai and is now the new ambassador to London. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Francesca Vendrell, Envoy Extraordinaire, former Special Representative of the EU in Afghanistan, personal representative of the Secretary General and the head of the UN Special Mission for Afghanistan. In those heady months during the assault against the Taliban in Afghanistan, which of course led to the fall of the Taliban at the end of 2001. Scott Warden joins us from the United States. He's the head of the Afghanistan and Central Asian programs at USIP. More than a decade experience in Afghanistan, working for the absolutely impressive CGAR, which is the accountability mechanism in the United States government for the Attorney General. He also served as the Election Complaints Commissioner in 2009. Please spare a thought for Scott. He's still recovering from being the Election Complaints Commissioner. Alex Steer, who I met, as one does, at a Buzkashi in northern Afghanistan many, many years ago, and he's rose through the ranks of USAID with the speed of a Buzkashi horse. And he comes to us from USAID to be the executive director of the ODI. Ladies and gentlemen, how to tell the story of Afghanistan in a few seconds or more. Once upon a time, not so long ago, well, it was 2001, you'll remember the mantra. We are with you for the long run. World leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with Afghans and said, we are here to make it better. What a roller coaster it was. 2 Loya Jirgas in the early years, including a constitutional Loya Jirga, presidential elections, parliamentary elections, moments of crisis, moments of celebration. A surge where international troops went up to more than 130,000, and then a withdrawal. A Taliban retreat, which became the rise of the Taliban. Until 2014, another historic moment, the first transfer of power between 2 heads of states. Hamid Karzai left office. Then came in not 1 but 2 leaders in Afghanistan, the National Unity Government. And this is where we're going to be situating a lot of our discussions today. From 2014, the National Unity Government, looking forward to the 2019 presidential elections. Something is not working in Afghanistan. Everybody here knows that. The basic premise of this report today is that a new approach is needed. If Afghanistan is ever to have a chance of achieving that political stability and prosperity, a restructuring of the political institutions, which will help, they hope, to change the political landscape. We're going to start with Scott and with Alex and have some comments from our experts, both in Kabul and here. We want your contributions too. We have some real experts. So let's begin. Scott, this report, special report, Political Stability in Afghanistan. What for you are some of the main takeaway points that you want us to focus on when you look to a new political approach to move Afghanistan from where it is now to something better?
Right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for all of you for being here. I want to elaborate a little bit on the points that you raised on the current situation, which is by way of diagnosis, and then go into what our report has in terms of prescription for a new approach. The first point, which you've already signaled, is that things are not going well in Afghanistan. There's been a slow but steady deterioration of security conditions over the last several years, particularly since the transition, the end of the NATO combat mission in 2014 through to now. But there's also been a deterioration, I think, in the political conditions of the country, which is something that we focus on in this report. You also have, as you mentioned, the U.S. policy review process, which will be a regional policy review, but the key points in that are about Afghanistan and what to do. Speculating on what the Trump administration will come out with in terms of policy is not a high percentage game, and I won't do that here. But I think that it does present an opportunity, and I think it will be my prediction is that it will be a constructive opportunity, because I think that the U.S. will continue to remain engaged significantly in Afghanistan, as well as the UK, European allies, and others. So our report is really in the context of continued international engagement, and how can international assistance work with Afghan leadership and also Afghan political dynamics and forces to create a more favorable environment for a resolution of the conflict. And by resolution of the conflict, it means reconciliation with the Taliban, but it also, one of the points we stress in the report, is it means reconciliation with other political factions in the country that have been at war or otherwise at odds with each other for the last 40 years. And I think we see this conflict as a continuation of underlying political dynamics that have to do with ethnicity, they have to do with regionalism within Afghanistan, and how to share and balance power among Afghan factions in a way that is sustainable and agreeable. So that's really the problem that we're looking at. I think that the debate so far has focused, at least in the U.S. side, and again, it's the U.S. policy that I think people are looking at as the next kind of big moment or announcement. There's been a lot of focus on troops and troop numbers. And I think it is very likely that U.S. forces will increase by a few thousand. And that certainly would be helpful given the deterioration of the security environment. But the point is that that is not going to fundamentally transform the conflict. It is not going to defeat the Taliban when 100,000 U.S. troops didn't before. It will buy time, it will buy space, and it will shore up, hopefully, the Afghan government's position so that they can do something. And then the question is, do what? Do what with that time and that opportunity? And that's where we propose 4 areas that should be focused on between now, the 2019 elections, and really on to assuming a new government with an electoral mandate in 2019 on to 2020, the title of the report. What are structural political things that can be done to alter the dynamics of the conflict so that there can be a negotiated settlement? I'll mention the 4. I'll talk about one, and I'll turn over to Alex to elaborate. Those are, first and foremost, the elections that are coming up. There are 2 sets of elections. Parliamentary and district council elections have been called for July of 2018. Then there's the constitutionally mandated election in 2019 for president. This is an opportunity to build political consensus, but also if fast elections are a precedent, it's an opportunity for destabilization. So I'll talk a little bit briefly about what can be done. The other areas are looking at the relationship of power between the center and the periphery, so between the central government, the provincial and local governments, decentralization so that there's more local autonomy and decision making. The third area is constitutional reform to look at the fundamental institutions of government. How do they function and what's the right balance of power? Let me just conclude by saying a few things about the upcoming elections. As I said, from 2009 and then again in 2014, on the one hand, elections are bought into by the Afghan people as a necessary, the best possible alternative of the alternatives to choose leadership. But they've been hugely destabilizing because there's been a lot of fraud and there's been highly controversial results. So in some ways, it has created political fragmentation when really elections are supposed to develop political consensus. I would say that looking ahead, to the interim elections for Parliament that are scheduled in 2018, the key here is really to make sure that reforms are in place so that the conditions are right for a successful election, or don't have them, or wait and get the reforms right for 2019, because presidential elections are far more important and they really will set the tone for whether the next government has a mandate to follow through on big political reforms that we're talking about, as well as to potentially negotiate with the Taliban. So getting elections right by focusing on voter registration, on some other technical details I'm happy to elaborate on but won't now, but getting the process right is really much more important than the timing between now and 2019. 2019 elections need to happen and should happen, but making sure that the process is positive to support them is really important. The second big point on elections is these are fundamentally political processes. And while there has a lot of attention and importance on technical reforms, at the end of the day, it's Afghan political leaders, whether they're political party leaders or the power brokers behind them, that need to come up with a common understanding of how power will be shared, of what the rights of the losers will be. This in many ways was the origin of the national unity government, was a dispute over how is the minority, the loser, going to be respected and apportioned seats in government. That's a political process that the international community can't dictate, shouldn't dictate, but I think can facilitate a conversation, a difficult one, among Afghan parties. And so thinking of ways diplomatically to have that conversation in the lead up to the elections rather than have it happen under pressure after the elections is a key goal.
Do you think there's enough time to get the election, the conditions right? We're talking about a country which hasn't had a census, a country which doesn't have an electoral roll, a country where large areas are not accessible for security, logistical reasons, that can be in place by 2018 for the district and parliamentary. It's a question of whether it's better to have a bad election or no election. What's worse?
Timing is very tight. It's theoretically possible, but in the next 2 months, we will know whether voter registration, which needs to be completely redone across the country, if that's rolling out and rolling out smoothly, then we can say there's time. But if not, I think the answer for the first time in a while is it's better to have no elections than bad elections, because really 2019 is the most important one, and there is time to get it right for then if you don't have an election in between.
Okay. Alex, so looking, what for you are some of the main challenges and obstacles that you've looked at this quite intensively about the roadmap ahead?
Well, I want to just reiterate your thanks and welcome to everybody. It's so great to see not only the fantastic panelists that we have, but some really special people here. And I just want to acknowledge two people really quickly who have been fundamentally, profoundly important people for me and for Afghanistan. Martin Barber, who's here, who was one of my first ever bosses, hired me into the UN, which he paid for, I'm sure. And Jolyon Leslie, who's been a friend and a mentor for many years, and both of you have had a lot more to say probably than I should, but I really appreciate you being here. And what Lise didn't mention is that this was 1994, and our guest, or our host rather, was Rashid Dostum. General Dostum, first Vice President Dostum, and I say that in part because it's funny, but in part because there's some. It's good to remember that these things are long processes. It's hard to say something new after 16 years or 24 years or 40 years. But as we were working on this report, and I'm grateful for Scott's partnership and USIP, I think that part of the point that we were trying to arrive at here is not that the tools radically change or somebody, unlike someone like Francesc or others who've spent their lives thinking about how to make peace, are going to suddenly come up with some new idea or there's going to be an app for that. It's that conditions change. And when conditions change, it's always important to go back to what we know does work. So I want to make three quick points. The first one is that all wars end. Most end with a negotiated settlement. There's the rare one that ends with military victory. I don't think anybody conceives that to be possible for Afghanistan. And so whether it's 2020 or 2030 or 2120, the Afghan war will end. And so thinking backward from that about how to accelerate progress to getting us to a point where there is a sustainable resolution of the Afghan conflict is something that always bears reconsideration, even though some of the circumstances that Scott outlined are grim and problematic, and more so than many of us expected them to be a decade plus ago. I think that the fundamental problem is one that we're still grappling with since 2001, is that a lasting, inclusive, and legitimate political settlement didn't happen in 2001, and that still does need to happen. And again, it is fundamentally important, as Scott said, that is about reconciliation, but it's really about much more than that, because it's actually about all the parties who have been and continue to come to the table in various forms every day, apart from the Taliban. That leads me to the second point, which is that in order for the Afghan conflict to be sustainably addressed, there is additional power sharing that is necessary. And if we didn't already know that and understand that, the experience of the last couple of years with the National Unity Government has just put such a fine point on two different things that really are fundamentally important, which is that, one, elections that end up with a sort of winner-take-all outcome in what is a fundamentally deeply divided society are not likely to produce the outcome that we all want. And so we need to find a way, the Afghans need to find a way to manage the fact that you do need elections, you do need central government to be able to do the types of things that people want to do, but centralized control in a fundamentally divided society is not going to be the way to do that, and all of these divisions get played upon by the foreign machinations that go on that keep Afghanistan's conflicts alive. And that power sharing, I believe, is not still fundamentally addressed within the current political and constitutional system, both for the reasons that Scott already outlined in terms of the elections, but what happened with the formation of the National Unity Government was a rift that we've all seen and knew that was coming, which is that when you have elections that are fundamentally between power groups and you have one side or another that's going to win, and as a result of that, some major parties that are effectively going to feel left out of power, there's two things that happen, either accommodation or conflict. And what happened in 2014 was a very rapid attempt at an extra-constitutional ad hoc accommodation, which has fundamentally failed. And so we can either continue along the path that is going to lead to failed accommodation, or we need to think about some of the mechanisms and structures, both at the national and subnational level, that can allow for greater accommodation and therefore power sharing, therefore a sense of broader inclusion in society, in the economy, in the political process that can ultimately lead to the outcome we seek. So my third point is that I do believe that a better distribution of power in Afghanistan is possible, and that I would say that there is no right answer. A lot of divided societies confront these challenges, and it's important to remember that somebody doesn't pop up and say, well, that's because you need to divide it this way, or have a trilateral presidency, or consociationalism, or whatever the flavor of the person advocating is. I don't believe that there's a right answer. The right answer for Afghanistan is that there's clearly a better answer than the one that's out there right now, and that's what really needs work. And so part of our starting point for this paper is to take the National Unity Government agreement seriously, and that agreement called for a couple of things that essentially haven't happened. It called for thinking about how to formalize the power sharing structure at the national level. Because a lot of that uncertainty about how power divided is where there's constant friction today. But it also called for following through on some of the things that the Constitution calls for, possibly a Loya Jirga to look at the Constitution, but even if you don't open up the Constitution, there are things that can be done within the Constitution that call for not only horizontal power sharing, which is what happens at the national level, but also vertical power sharing. Thinking about the ways in which provincial governors are selected, the roles of provincial councils. What is the role for municipalities in a rapidly urbanizing society like Afghanistan? Should local governors, should local mayors be elected? Should they be chosen at least with the consensus of people at the local level? How do we deal with the pernicious problem of things like district elections, which have been called for since the Constitution was signed in 2004, but have been too hard to pull off and may remain too hard to pull off next year as well? And the final point that I want to end with is on reconciliation, because a lot of people say, well, look, if reconciliation is coming, you don't want to try to deal with all of this stuff now because the Taliban are then going to come and you're going to have to open up a whole new set of negotiations. But I actually think that that's the wrong approach, because I believe that the only way you are going to have an environment in which there can be successful negotiations, in which there can be successful models for power sharing with the Taliban and others that come in out of the cold, you need to have that model existing today. You need to have the avenues open. People need to understand how it is that you can actually share power successfully and open the framework not only so it's not just about the presidential elections, but power sharing across the country. And I think that by setting that table, by setting that environment now, it'll actually make an outcome of longer-term facilitated negotiations with insurgents more likely in the long run.
Very comprehensive agenda, which comes down to the fundamental point of power sharing, both at the center, but also in the provinces, and then right down to the district and to the city level. But it's a bit of a catch-22, isn't it? Because it's often said that the Taliban gains strength, and it strengthens their narrative to see a power sharing agreement which is not working, and they just think it's going to be a matter of time. But to fundamentally change it, you do have to open up the Constitution. Now you have a CEO along with the president. If you want to have a prime minister to fundamentally change the structure, you do have to open up the Constitution. And the idea is, well, don't do it now because the Taliban will come to the table and they will ask for the Constitution to be changed. So what comes first? But you believe that the seeds of a solution are in the current national unity government, that it has to be, Afghanistan needs a different power sharing at the center, and to change what your report calls the most centralized government in the world.
Yeah, I think that the National Unity Government Agreement fundamentally recognizes the fact that there's a problem, right? That's why we have the National Unity Government. The National Unity Government Agreement called for changes, including possibly a Loya Jirga, including the formalization of some kind of position. And I think that those are options to be pursued. It's not clear what the right outcome is. That's the Afghans have to decide, but it's clear that the current arrangement isn't working. And the reason why I think the National Unity Government hasn't been successful is because they set up a mechanism for supposed power sharing, but all of that power sharing was unclear. And so they've spent the intervening several years fighting over every aspect of power sharing instead of getting on with the process of governing and consolidating authority and lifting up the economy of the country, all the things that are going to be necessary for Afghanistan to move forward.
Most of all, appointments and
Yeah.
a lot of disputes. Let's bring in someone who's right at the heart of power, Fawzia Kofi. We're discussing here about a power structure which doesn't seem to be working. What is your view from someone who has to work within that structure in the parliament? Do you think that, do you have some thoughts about how Afghanistan should move forward in looking again at this issue of how do you share power, particularly in Kabul, but then with the provinces as well?
Thank you, Liz. It's wonderful to see great friends like yourself, Alex, Scott, and of course our Ambassador Jawad, and an old friend of Afghanistan, Ambassador Benzel, which I was happily surprised to see him today. Thank you, Alex, for bringing everybody together. To your question, Liz, in 2014, when just post the second round of the presidential election, Afghanistan was almost at the peak of falling into another conflict. And therefore, the leaders in both camps came together to work on a political settlement, and as a result of that, the national unity government was established. The core for during the negotiation to establish the national unity government was the power sharing and decentralization of power, vertically also to reach out, as Alex mentioned, the enriched growing population of Afghanistan out in the districts and provinces. Initially, few months, it went things were on the right direction. Although it took a lot longer time to establish a cabinet, which was the nature of a unity government, where the two main source of power come together. But over time, eventually, Afghanistan national unity government lost that main core point of its establishment, which is the power sharing. And the president apparently now holds the whole power, and there is very little sign of power sharing. Based on the national unity government, both leaders were supposed to have elections in 2 years' time to make the chief executive officer position as an elected executive prime minister. Which could be legally, argued and according to the constitution. Now, there are arguments that if you open up the constitution, other unnecessary amendments might be proposed to the amendments of the constitution, which I think to some extent is invalid argument, because in the national unity government political proposal, it's very clearly mentioned that the constitution is going to be amended only to create a position of executive prime minister position. So I think any other discussion during the constitutional amendment would be out of the political context of what the two sides agreed. So now the main challenge for Afghan government and politician is lack of power sharing and lack of clear vision on how are we going to shape a future of Afghanistan politics, because everything else, including security, including rule of law, including human rights, depend on the power sharing situation. It's true that Afghanistan planned parliamentary election for 2018 July, and hopefully followed by presidential election in 2019. But reform of the electoral process was the main commitment. I was supposed to be implemented as soon as the two leaders come to power. But 3 years after the election commission, I don't want to present a negative situation. Electoral reforms is not only about individuals. I mean, Scott has been working with the ECC, the Election Complaint Commission in Afghanistan, and I think he needs a rest still after his involvement in Afghanistan ECC for 1 year. But it's not only about personnel. It's not about individuals. Individuals who have been appointed in the IEC, the Independent Election Commission. There are a lot of questions about their neutrality, and there is a lot of question in the public about whether we are going to have an elected parliament, given the security situation, given the fact that there has not been enough reforms in the process of electoral reforms, or we will have a selected parliament. I think in the worst case scenario, people would like to see a better parliament, an elected parliament, rather than just a selected parliament. So that's the main thing for our friends to work with, who are supporting Afghanistan's future democracy, to ensure that we have an election that is for the purpose and for the sake of election, not selection. This is the first thing. The second thing is about 2019. I think the main involvement of our leaders, mainly the president right now, is preparing himself on the ground for 2019 presidential election. And that results lack of delivery in the institutions of the government, including parliament, but also mainly executive institutions. And he also proposed the reform agenda, which to some extent the reforms have been welcome and appreciated, especially his priority about fighting corruption. But the general perception in Afghanistan is that the president, under the name of reform, is just pursuing his own very much centralized policies over the whole Afghanistan. And that's why you see resistance. There have been protests, there have been people who resist and talk against it, which I think the consequences and the backlash will not be very healthy for the very new democracy of Afghanistan. So therefore, I think, yes, people want reform, but reforms with the demand of people. Sometimes our international friends also try to show the situation in Afghanistan or demonstrate that everything to some extent is fine, which I also think that things are much better comparing to Taliban. But why should we always compare the situation to Taliban regime? I mean, we had good times in Afghanistan before Taliban. Comparing to Taliban, yes, things are okay. We are enjoying somehow a freedom of speech. The fact that you see me connected online today, joining your conference live, indicates that Afghanistan has progress, but that is not enough. We shouldn't stick to the progress and achievement that we have achieved 2004, 2005. We have to have new achievements, and that new achievements really need solidarity and sharing, fair and justice sharing of power. I think at this stage, what is lacking is the fair share of power among different politicians, and there is a fear that eventually, if this is not addressed, Afghanistan might fall into another security deterioration and another crisis that it will be so difficult for us to manage. And as a woman, I feel more because, recently I just was in one of the provinces, Liz, that a whole province in West, where, it's a province that suffers from human rights, especially women's rights violation, and the lack of rule of law is very visible there. I went there, and when I was talking to the public about, why there is human rights and women's rights violation, the answer I got from people was, Ms. Kufi, there is the situation. I mean, everybody, not only women, everybody in this country is suffering. So why should you finger point to women? I mean, everybody is not in a very healthy situation, and the situation doesn't look, in terms of the future vision of the leaders, it doesn't look very bright. So I think for the bright future of Afghanistan, our president, along with our partners, international partners, who I know love both our leaders. I know that they are very accessible to our international partners, and when any embassy locks the door of these leaders, they're very easy to meet them, and that's why they are loved by international community. But at the end of the day, democracy is not double standard. It's not about people in the United States and in the UK, and it's about leader in Afghanistan. That's a double standard of democracy. If we really want democracy to survive longer in Afghanistan, we have to listen to people, and our leaders should listen to people.
Fawzia Koofi, thank you so much for that, eloquent description of some of what are the key problems in your country today, and reminding us that that was supposed to be from day one a discussion of electoral reform. That was part of the National Unity Agreement, and you were right to say Afghanistan was on the precipice, and that agreement did rescue Afghanistan, but never dealt with the issues, and also mentioning too about the concern about the centralization of power. I would urge all of you to read the New York Times article that Fawzia was involved with after her trip to Gore. It's entitled "No Value, No Justice." And I don't want to give you another reason to feel angry about the absence of justice in Afghanistan, but it's absolutely dreadful reading about not just the violence against women in one province, Gore, but also the impunity in which it is carried out. So well done, Fawzia, for highlighting that. We're going to come back to you, Fawzia, because we want to pick up on some of your very, very key points. But I wanted to bring in Francesca, who, of course, was very much in one of the seats of power during those crucial years where difficult decisions had to be made about the constitution, about the sharing of power, about how to run elections in Afghanistan. If you could just give us now, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps a few of the lessons learned that Afghanistan can build on to try to move toward a more stable political future, and some of the power sharing that everyone is mentioning is so crucial to both stability and prosperity.
Well, it's good to hear, by the way, and I very much enjoyed the report of USIP. I was not in the seat of power. Maybe that was the mistake. I call for lots of things that should have happened both earlier and faster, and they didn't happen. One of them, of course, was to prevent the leaders of the Northern Alliance from being taken over control of Afghanistan before the dispatch of an international force like the one that ISAF was eventually dispatched. The second thing, another mistake, and this is still impacting the various issues that I wanted briefly to touch on, what has been the lack of a DDR process and the fact that DIARC, the disbandment of illegal armed groups, never really happened. And therefore, when we are looking at, and the third thing is the way the Constitution was drafted. Let's face it, it was not drafted by a Constituent Assembly. It was drafted by a group appointed by the president under a lot of influence of jihadists. It was not a very good, it is not a very good constitution. I certainly think that revision is called for. But before we think of all that, let's remember the problem of not having the government lacking the monopoly on the means of violence. And this means that whatever changes you want to do to the Constitution, you are faced with problems. Take, for example, the idea of governors, elected governors. Yes, that in theory is a very good idea, a very good point. But will not the warlord in the province manage to win the election? Second, we talk about a prime ministerial system. My idea of a prime ministerial system is, I'm afraid, not the one that people in the north of Afghanistan demand. I believe that the prime minister should have executive power, and that responsible to parliament, and that the president would be a kind of figurehead who would appoint the prime minister, but who basically would have power similar to the ones that the president of Germany, the president of Italy, and other constitutional presidents have. If you're going to have a prime ministerial system in the way, meaning that the president and the prime minister will share power, you're going to have the same problems you are facing today and that were faced in 1992-93 between Hekmatyar and Rabbani. So I think this is something that, in my view, ought to be avoided. Finally, the elections. Well, I would very much hope that finally presidential and parliamentary elections can be held at the same time. It was a mistake, I won't go into it, but elections should be held at the same time. There is time to hold them in 2019, but I have to go back to the issues that I raised in 2009 at the time of the presidential elections. And this was the lack of security, particularly in Pashtun areas, which means that it is very difficult to monitor elections in that part of the world. And in a way, you're really left with two choices. One is not to hold elections in insecure areas, which harms the Pashtuns, which means disfranchising a lot of Pashtuns, or holding elections everywhere, as has been done in the past, but then you're going to open the door to accusations of ballot stuffing and of fraud. Thank you.
Thank you. Among the many good points you raised, there is that question about the decentralization of power, that if it's going to be captured by the very warlords who are acting with impunity. And your report makes the point that, well, you may have to do that to allow Afghanistan to have the experience of rotating power, let them come into power, let them make mistakes, and hopefully if the situation, the new electoral the situation is strong enough, then that person will be booted out and it will encourage the development of new leadership. I mean, that's the optimistic assessment.
But I think there was a very good point made in the report about the possible election of mayors. And I think it could be done it could be done progressively, as has happened in the UK. We first started with a mayor of London. Why not start with a mayor of Kabul, where I think the conditions are easier for holding elections than they might be, let's say, in Mazar-e-Sharif or Herat.
Actually, it's quite interesting that, and a reminder that Afghanistan's problems are not just Afghanistan. You're the mayor of London. The same problem would be with the mayor of Kabul. You become the mayor of London, and then you think, oh my goodness, here's a prime minister in waiting. So then you have the mayor of Kabul, and the politicians worry that this person has so much influence, can get so many votes, that he's one step away from the ARG and he's going to be the next president of Afghanistan. I mean, there's no ideal solutions. But thank you. Pastor Jawad.
Yes.
I want to just pick up, there was Fauzi Kofi's very last comment touched on what has been one of the searing conclusions, both simple and searing at the same time, about the main failure of the international engagement in Afghanistan, which is that the outside world did not listen to Afghans enough. And your report makes it clear that this process that you talk about must be led by Afghans. It is not for the international community to be in any of the driving seats. But of course, Afghanistan is still a country which needs support. And I wonder if we could bring you in, Ambassador Jawad, when you look at some of the challenges facing Afghanistan now, how would you like to see the international community, what kind of support you would need? And as was discussed at the beginning, it's not just a question of troops.
Thank you very much. It's great being in this panel with many very good, long-standing friends of Afghanistan. Again, and I'm very much grateful both to ODI and USAIP to keep focus on Afghanistan, and that's greatly appreciated. And of course, Liz, everybody know her for her international work, but she's been going to Afghanistan for 30 years. So she was in grammar school, but she started going to Afghanistan. So, kindergarten, yeah. So that's. You have started your discussion by saying that something doesn't work in Afghanistan. Yes, but many things works in Afghanistan. So we should not overreact. And we should keep in mind that despite the shortfall of the current setup in government, the Afghan government is on track. We have just actually yesterday, the GSMP indicated that the growth rate in Afghanistan was 3%. Everybody expected a negative growth. We have experienced 3% growth rate. Our security forces have maintained the security in Afghanistan despite the fact that 150,000 international troops withdrew from Afghanistan with all their capabilities. So, as far as the elections is concerned, neither President Ghani nor Dr. Abdullah is indicating that there will be no elections. In fact, they are, according to them, according to their instructions that they given to the government in the schedule set in Afghanistan, they are on track for 2018 and 2019. So the main point is that we should consider Afghanistan as a comprehensive country. There are challenges, there are difficulties in Afghanistan, but we should not make recommendations based on certain challenges for the future of Afghanistan. Francis and I were part of the group that actually did work on the constitution back in Afghanistan in 2002 and 2003. Yes, we did impose actually an overly centralized system in Afghanistan. The reason was, but many Afghans were thinking that a decentralized system in Afghanistan meant a dissolution of the government. So there was a demand by the Afghan. It was not just actually a recommendation by the international community. The Afghan wanted to have a stronger centralized system because they experienced the civil war and the disintegration of the state institution. So now that we encounter some challenges in governance and we should not actually prescribe a new solution. Let's go to decentralized system. If we don't have resources in Afghanistan, if we don't have a human capital to govern properly and to deliver services, doesn't matter if you deliver it from Kabul or Balkh, the people is not going to benefit. Let's work on building the capacity and the resources of the government to deliver services, regardless under which framework. Yes, the elections, and presidential election, parliamentary election, all had their own challenges. We should not be overly actually fixated that we should have actually a provincial or district elections. We have spent, you and I, the international community in Afghanistan, have spent in each parliamentary election $300 million. But we did not spend $3 million on vetting systems to make sure that people who really represent Afghans in Afghanistan will get into this parliament. So therefore, I just want to make it clear that this government, despite the challenges, made some really tough decisions on reconciliation. A country that is going through almost 30 years of war. We made a tough decision on reconciliation with Hikmat Yar, painful decision, difficult decision, and Afghans did it themselves. There was no involvement of the international community, and it had a result. So let's give some credit for the work that the Afghans and the international community are doing in Afghanistan. Again, here, and especially being here in the UK, new in here, the assistance that the UK has provided in Afghanistan has changed the life of many people. I'm so proud that to see Fawzia Koofi speaking from Afghanistan, a capable leader like her. And also the connectivity that she can speak from remote provinces of Afghanistan to us in here. Not only the connectivity, she speaks the same language that we all do. And she sees the problems the way every one of us do. So Afghanistan has changed drastically. And the notion that it's a kind of isolated country with a lot of tribes, it's a colonial view of Afghanistan, and it's wrong. Let's be clear about that. Afghanistan is tribal. Why? Because there's diversity. Well, London is 100 times more tribal because there's more diversity in London. More languages, more. So the diversity of Afghanistan is a source of pride for us. It should not be seen as a handicap for the Afghans. Their lack of institution, their lack of capability to deliver services, but the geographic location, it's regarded as a kind of a places in between, like one of my friends says, no, it is a connecting place. It's a place that actually connected many civilizations in that region. So just to be short on that, I just want to say we are very grateful for the focus that Afghanistan still gets from our friends. Greatly appreciate that, and particularly the recommendation by the reports that the next solution should be in consultation with the Afghans. But yet at the same time, neither us Afghans nor our international friends hurry up actually to impose or suggest a solution, because we could be making the mistake that we did for an over-centralized system in Afghanistan. We have to give a little bit more time and also a little bit more content to the existing institution, instead of thinking, well, we tried that, it didn't work, let's try something else. Give it a little bit more time. Give it a little bit more chance. Allow the Afghans to build the necessary human capital to make the existing institutions more functional. And especially this is in the context of centralized or decentralized system. That's all. I don't want to go into too much of a detail, but again, a great degree of appreciation for keeping the focus on Afghanistan, and also not forgetting that the country has changed drastically. There is a voice for Afghanistan coming from Badakhshan provinces or from here, and that is these voices should actually be a determined factor for the future of Afghanistan.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's. Yes, it does bear highlight that the past is a different country, that the Afghanistan of 2001 is not the Afghanistan of today. Both witness Fawzia Koofi and all the other women parliamentarians, civil society, the fact that it has a constitution, it has had elections, that a generation has been educated, that Afghans are not just fighting in the security forces, but so many young Afghans are choosing to stay in Afghanistan to fight for a better Afghanistan is truly, truly inspiring, at times verging on heroic, some of the efforts of Afghans. And we salute all of the efforts of Afghans, and that they will continue to make them.